So my goal with creating a YouTube channel and regularly publishing content to it has always been to try to invite people to take the claims of Christianity and the church seriously. And why would I do that? Well, if I'm going to try to, psychoanalyze myself, if I consider the weaker parts of my character, it might be for tribalistic reasons, like I want my tribe and my camp to be strengthened. But I also know there's a big part of me, and I would like to think that it's the bigger part that wants to see others benefit from those claims in the way that I have. And I know that's merely anecdotal. I'm not trying to put that out there like it's some sort of proof for the validity of Catholicism or even theism in general. But I have an intimate understanding of the differences between Catholic Brian and, let's say, Pagan Brian, for lack of a better phrase, because I've lived both of those lives. Pagan Brian was directionless, hopeless, struggling to realize any of the goals that I had in my life, experiencing personal, embarrassing failures, and ultimately depressed and lonely. Catholic Brian still has adversities. And in fact, I would argue quite a few more adversities because I've taken on a lot more in life, in part inspired by the confidence that my Catholicism gives me. I'm confident now in my moral direction. I have hope. I'm surrounded by the kinds of people and friendships that I wouldn't trade my former life for at all, in which I'm able to fall asleep at night peacefully, not racked by guilt. And that's not to say that I don't have things that I regret or that I don't have guilt at times, but I now have like this IV bag of grace and forgiveness that I carry around with me constantly and that I can always turn to as a way to soothe my soul and to give me hope and confidence that no matter what happens, no matter what mistakes I make in this life, there's always an opportunity for redemption. There's always an opportunity to grow and to learn from that, as opposed to just being stuck with that guilt. You know, like our secular culture has phrases like the walk of shame. Have you ever done the walk of shame? I just don't have experiences of that kind of shame and regret after doing something reckless and stupid the night before. If you sacrifice Pagan Brian from Catholic Brian, you're left with a difference that is, it's just so good in my experience. So good that I desperately want other people to experience it as well. That's what motivates me to sacrifice a portion of my work week and therefore my income to be doing this kind of thing. More and more, the attention of people like me who started this with the hopes of evangelizing has turned to internal battles within the church, which for outsiders looking in isn't a great way to say, you know, hey, you should become Catholic too. And this past week, I was interviewed by a former Catholic. He was raised in a very traditional family named Kevin O'Connor. And I'll try to remember to include the link in my show notes. But if I don't remember, just look up Kevin O'Connor on YouTube. Kevin Non-Trad Cath, I think is the handle, something like that. But one of the questions that I was asked was about the habit of criticizing the Pope and the bishops and why I do it if I do it, and certainly why other people do it. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately because it's so counterproductive for those of us who want to be out there evangelizing to also find ourselves making an exhibition out of the internal dysfunctions in the church. So I wanted to take more time to address this and to address this phenomenon towards non-Catholics, to take the opportunity to share with non-Catholics why there seems to be so much anger and infighting in the church today, in the hopes that it's something that you might actually be able to understand better and to sympathize with and to maybe even see and appreciate some of the good in it, or at least the good intentions in it. Simultaneously, I also want to address us Catholics in the hope of doing a better job of conducting ourselves through the various conflicts that have taken place and will likely continue to do so in the future. So let me start by sharing a little bit about what it's been like to be Catholic for like the past 15 or 20 years, which describes about how long I've been a Catholic. On the front end of that time span, there was like a tidal wave of news about sex abuse. And initially, I think a lot of Catholics, especially those who are devoted to their pastors, were a bit defensive about this. We were trying to rationalize it and perhaps maybe even minimize it a bit. One fairly common talking point that you would hear was that it's no more common in the Catholic Church than anywhere else, which is still true depending on how you present that information. And by contemporary statistics, I think it's even actually lower in the Catholic Church than a lot of other major institutions that we might consider. But nonetheless, we as Catholics have become branded, and I really mean branded, like our public brand, and I'm a branding professional, so I know what that means. It means like the impression that the public has of you, all the associations and the things that they think of when they think of the Catholic Church. Our public brand is synonymous with sexual abuse now. And objectively speaking, that's just not fair. It betrays an egregious double standard. For example, some research suggests that sex abuse in public schools occurs at a rate that dramatically outpaces anything that has happened in the Catholic Church. One study I saw said that nearly 10% of students that were surveyed shared some kind of experience of unwanted sexual, physical contact and abuse with personnel in their schools, like teachers and coaches. But we don't think of public education as being synonymous with pedophilia or child abuse. When someone is in the public eye promoting the interests of public education, it's unlikely someone is going to accuse them of being a supporter of child molestation. But every time, without fail, if I put out a video discussing something like arguments for the existence of God contra atheism, I'll see a litany of comments accusing me of being some sort of a shill for child molesters. And it wasn't me or people like me who abused any children. It was primarily clergy and bishops and other bishops who covered up for them. Here's the thing that I don't think many people have much appreciation for. The victims of abuse were and are Catholics. It's not like Catholic clergy were out roaming the streets preying on non-Catholic children. We ourselves, we who sit in the pews, were betrayed and abused by our own pastors and bishops. You don't need to tell us that there's a problem. You don't need to accuse us and act like we're somehow indifferent or blind to this phenomenon. We are the victims of that problem, not somehow outsiders to it. We were betrayed by our own leaders in the most reprehensible way. What could be more evil than sexually abusing vulnerable children in your midst? Lay Catholics are the victims, yet it's lay Catholics who are smeared by association and who have to bankrupt ourselves and our institutions and our own parishes to pay out massive settlements. And what kind of a response have we seen from bishops and leaders? Nothing anywhere close to matching the demands of justice given the circumstances. There's been a lot of courageous talk, a lot of zero tolerance policies and such, but very little actual credible action. Take one of the most famous cases of all, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who was the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, D.C., which is one of the most important prelates in the United States, the person who occupies that chair. He has a record of abuse and misdeeds spanning his entire career, going all the way back through multiple dioceses in which he was employed. And over the course of his career, complaints were made to all of those dioceses, including Rome, and to the nunciature, which is sort of like the diplomatic headquarters of the United States to Rome. The point being here, lots of people knew about his behavior, his pattern of abuse, and what he was up to. Clergy and staff who worked around him, bishops who then succeeded him and would have had exposure to all this information, and those who investigated complaints against him in Rome as well. There were even multiple cash settlements in the dioceses that he was a bishop to victims of his abuse. Multiple bishops, some of whom are now cardinals in the US, had been informed about him while he was still a bishop and while they were in a governing position to do something about it, but refused to believe it and claimed that they were just incredulous rumors. It was just gossip. Even though Cardinal Tobin, for example, who succeeded him in the Diocese of Newark, where there was already a record of abuse settlements that he would have been privy to. And in spite of all of that obvious corruption, nobody has been held accountable. Many of those same people are still in high-ranking and influential positions as bishops and cardinals, like I said. Many are still pastors. Many are still employed in diocesan offices. Nobody other than Cardinal McCarrick has faced any kind of consequences. J.D. Flynn, who is one of the editors of The Pillar, which cannot be accused of being like tabloid outrage media or sensationalism. They're a very respectable journalistic outlet. He said this on Twitter: Just a reminder that no living contemporaries of McCarrick have faced consequences for the prospect of having looked the other way, and no churchmen who were in secretarial, vicarious, or auxiliary roles to the former cardinal have been examined for the prospect of complicity. And for a considerable amount of time, before all of this became public knowledge and was exposed as a scandal, McCarrick had been obviously sidelined. People had noticed that he was no longer in the public eye. According to some, he was forbidden from exercising public ministry by Pope Benedict's orders. And then shortly after Pope Francis assumed the papal chair, McCarrick was mysteriously just back in business, flying around the world, jet-setting, as some reports said it, making deals, and according to one Washington Post article, he was working harder than ever. Rome, for its part, never conducted any sort of transparent investigation that was open and accessible to the public to explain or to investigate why it didn't implement certain measures and disciplines against him, or why there seemingly were disciplinary measures against him that were then removed so that he was rehabilitated and able to enjoy public ministry again. Fast forward to today, and again, if you're following publications like The Pillar, it seems like on a weekly basis, there's some new news report about serious corruption in the church, often an abuse case that has been ignored or mishandled, or there's been some sort of cover-up, like the case of Father Marco Rupnik, who was a Jesuit priest who is something of a celebrity artist in the Diocese of Rome. He was responsible for creating multiple commissions of artwork there in chapels and churches. He was leading retreats in the Vatican. He was designing logos for Vatican initiatives, but he was also demonically, habitually, and ritually grooming and abusing countless religious sisters while he was their spiritual director. At one point, apparently he was tried and then excommunicated, and then that excommunication was mysteriously lifted under circumstances that don't really seem to make sense. Then he was expelled from the Jesuits once this was starting to reflect poorly on them. Then he was suddenly incarnated in good standing in a diocese in Slovenia. And then the latest reports are that he's back in Rome, enjoying much of the freedom and favor that he used to enjoy. And that same community of religious sisters, that is the victims of this abuse, well, they've since been shut down. There are also multiple bishops and prelates from various corners of the globe who are credibly accused of, in some cases, abuse themselves, serious misconduct that is unbecoming of anyone who wants to be thought of as a pastor, as someone who represents Christ to the world. These are people who have resigned in disgrace. These are people who have mishandled abuse allegations, but have been since sheltered and given prestigious jobs in the Vatican. There are lots of names that I could point out that fit what I just described, but maybe the most recent, who has also been courting a lot of controversy, is Cardinal Fernandez, who is the current prefect for the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. That is, he's in charge of the teaching organ of the church. He has been accused of mishandling serious abuse cases himself, and even conceded that he didn't handle things right. And he is now in charge of the dicastery that is in charge of handling abuse cases. Although with that said, strangely enough, he has been somehow forbidden from actually being part of the investigation process of abuse cases, without any explanation for why he's not included in that process, which is all very suspicious, obviously. And there was a time in the church in which the media would relentlessly chase down any lead that could suggest that there was some sort of scandal or abuse that they could pin on the church, and especially the Pope. Anything they could accuse Pope Benedict of, there was round-the-clock headlines about this. But now, in a time when there are potential headlines everywhere, this has been going on for quite some time, at least a decade, in which there have been serious scandals that they would have been salivating over 20 years ago. Now they're conspicuously silent. Not only are they silent, but they're actually rubbing our noses in the fact that they believe the opposite narrative, thinking of movies like The Two Popes, in which Pope Benedict is is unambiguously accused of being the bad guy, and Francis, the great reformer who is going to fight against sexual abuse and corruption in the church. So given the scale of betrayal and victimization of the people of God, the people of the church, by their own leaders, their own pastors, their own shepherds, you'd think we would have by now, because this is old news at this point. By now, we would have entered into an era of transparency, penance, and accountability in the church. You'd think we would see bishops walking around in sackcloth and ashes, but we haven't. Many of the same bad actors are just carrying on in important roles with like a business as usual casual attitude. Think about what that does to those of us who consider ourselves faithful Catholics. Think about the position that puts us in, where we have the knowledge that this kind of thing that I've been describing isn't being taken seriously and is probably going to continue. What it does is it creates an environment of suspicion against our bishops and our clergy, and frankly, rightly so. They haven't been held accountable, and instead of apologizing and facing the music, they're just denying they knew anything about it, including the Pope. But that is an intolerable and an unimaginable cancerous evil just festering in the heart of the church. And we as faithful Catholics, those of us who have been paying attention to this news, we know it's there in the shadows, and it won't be dealt with anytime soon. Think about the position that puts faithful Catholics in. Think about the position it puts people like myself and people who care about my Catholic faith, who care about outsiders and the potential for them to adopt the Catholic faith. On the one hand, if I try to just promote the Catholic faith, I get accused of being complicit in sexual abuse. On the other, if I try to object and criticize internally the church, then it looks like I'm just exposing infighting and being unfaithful, and that looks bad either way. Furthermore, for faithful Catholics who don't have a platform like someone like me and who feel helpless in their fight to protect themselves and their own children, they find themselves in this environment of suspicion against their own leaders, and I would say justifiably so. Whenever we get a whiff of any kind of funny business from our bishops, it sets our teeth on edge. And there has been a lot of funny business going on, ongoing scandals, ongoing denials, and seemingly relentless attempts to downplay and normalize certain sexual proclivities by distorting or obscuring traditional church teaching. Because nobody who truly loves Jesus and follows his teachings would be capable of this kind of evil. So we're left to conclude that they are wolves in sheep's clothing. They're not true Christians and they're not true pastors, and they're still among us. And since they won't conduct investigations or offer us any kind of transparency, we're just left to our own suspicions, which is all we have to protect ourselves. So when we see confusing doublespeak and this sort of activist tainted theology coming out of Rome, or corrupt clergy being welcomed back into the inner circle, while anyone who even glances at the Pope in a disapproving manner is stripped of their pensions and defrocked or cast out of their dioceses, lay people like myself have to really push back against the urge to just light a match on the whole thing and walk away. But when we do object, when we do criticize, when we do even denounce, which is justified at times given what we're talking about here, we then are accused of being divisive, rash, and even schismatic by other Catholics. Because it's true, we do owe loyalty and obedience to the Pope and to the bishops, but they also owe us something that a lot of people don't seem to want to admit. They are supposed to protect and transmit the faith that has been handed on to us from the apostles, the tradition of the faith. They aren't supposed to be innovators and activists, and it should go without saying that they have an obligation to protect the sheep and govern the church with care. But they haven't, and they aren't. And this isn't the fault of Catholicism. This isn't the fault of the Bible or the teachings of the church or the apostles or the great tradition that somehow, in spite of all of this darkness, still gets transmitted. We have bad leaders and bad actors, but that doesn't mean that the church is evil or worth ignoring any more than bad politicians mean that a certain country is evil. The church is the people of God in the same way that a country isn't just some of the politicians that occupy its ranks. It's the people of that country. And by and large, the people of the church and the people of most countries are good, honest, and faithful. So, I don't know, I've been ranting a lot here. I have to try and land this and figure out what are some takeaways from it all. I would say for Catholics, to start with, we need to show more sympathy for our fellow Catholics. And I would especially direct this to the so-called group of people who have been called this, but they also seem to call themselves Pope-splainers, who are quick to accuse anyone who objects to everything I've just described as somehow being unfaithful and schismatic. It's just not that simple. It's way more complicated and way more nuanced than that. The Catholic faithful, again, have been betrayed by our leadership in the worst possible ways you can imagine. I think that under the circumstances, people who criticize and object in the midst of all of that can be given some room to offer such criticisms, even angry criticism towards a hierarchy. And the Pope, likewise, if he is complicit in some of this, shouldn't be immune to that either. If anything, the hierarchy should be welcoming it. But because they're not, the conflict and the criticism, it only kind of escalates into this hysterical pitch. And for those Catholics who have been denouncing and objecting and criticizing or consuming content that teases your sense of outrage, let me say this: we cannot forget charity. We complain a lot that charity without truth, it degrades into some sort of like weak sentimentalism, and that's true. But truth without charity is just as bad for the opposite reason. It can become this just heartless and vindictive. And I get the impulse to resist the demands of charity because bad actors will take advantage of it. This is the strongest temptation, and I'm speaking from my own experience, against loving your own neighbor. How often does the suspicion of the villainy or the corruption of your neighbor prevent you from loving them? A stereotypical example of this is when, someone who gives the appearance of being a poor person comes and asks for money, like a panhandler. And you think to yourself, well, first of all, do they need it? Do they have other means of getting the support that they need? And second of all, what are they going to do with this? Is it really loving to give them money? Is it a good thing for them and for me to show them love in this way under these circumstances? Or is it just going to be something that they're going to take advantage of and use for evil purposes? And because of those kinds of considerations, I don't mean just specifically the circumstances I just described. That's an analogy for a whole broad range of what it means to love your neighbor. But there are some people who look at that and they'll say, I'll practice love of neighbor, fine, unless they are my enemy. But Jesus said that we have to love our neighbors as well. Why? Well, because it might help them be converted to the truth, but also if we refuse to exercise love, you're instead allowing yourself to be converted to their way of thinking and acting when you should be converting them. Even if they persist in their ways, agreeing to love others means you will still be blameless before God. When you had the chance to return evil for evil, like David had with Saul, you practice mercy and restraint. And remember, God doesn't need you to punish our enemies. Nobody escapes justice in the end. And if you're unsure about that, Romans 12 says, never avenge yourself, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And with all of that said, that doesn't mean we have to be indifferent towards evil. That doesn't mean we have to be pacifists in the face of corruption and evil. If someone is actively harming you, you can retreat from that, or you can defend yourself justifiably so, and you can and should especially defend the innocent. We should oppose corruption in the church, but never allow ourselves to become bitter, hopeless, and rash, or whatever other vices might be waiting for us when we attempt to respond to corruption in the church. If you're a Catholic who is a leader in your profession and you're like me, you probably had some desire for more opportunities to network with other Catholic professional leaders in order to help each other grow professionally, spiritually, and economically. Because this is exactly what we're doing with Fisher's Network. We're mobilizing Catholic professionals and economic leaders into local crews so that they can better support one another in the hopes of building up something like a local Catholic economy. As they do so, they can better support their parish in a variety of ways. Imagine as a parish having a group of experts you can turn to for advice and support on business decisions that have to be made. This is why pastors participate in our crews as well. They get business mentorship while having the opportunity to build up leaders in their community. So if this sounds like a way to strengthen your local Catholic community or parish, consider becoming a member by visiting fishersnetwork.com.